members. It's my great pleasure to welcome Robert Deemer this week as our speaker in our series of speakers. He is the recipient of the 2018 ASCAP Deems Taylor Virgil Thompson Internet Award. He's a composer, conductor, educator, author, and advocate. His works have been commissioned and performed by the Buffalo Philharmonic, the President's Own Marine Band, the U.S. Army Orchestras, the winged ensembles at the University of Texas, University of Missouri, Kansas City, the Rasha Saxophone Quartet, Load Bang, Acropolis Reed Quintet, and so many other groups. His work as an advocate for underrepresented composers led him to create the Composer Diversity Database and the Institute for Composer Diversity. As an author, he has written for the New Music Box, Sequence of 21, New York Times, and he is the professor and head of the composition at the State University of New York at Fredonia. So, Rob, thank you so much for being with us. It's a great pleasure for us to host you. First of all, congratulations on being the recipient of a 2021 funding from a Sphinx organization. So we would love to hear all about that and what that means to the Institute. So tell us all about the Institute and what all this means.
Sure. Well, Chris, thank you again for having me, and thank you all for your really amazing thoughts. Chris shared them with me, and your responses to what you've already been seeing this semester are truly amazing. I'm really quite impressed. Okay, so where should we start? There was a lot.
Why don't we start with the Institute and how it came to be?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So in a nutshell, because I know that we want to get to questions and all of that. Basically, so I'm literally, for those of you who don't know, Fredonia is only about 3 hours and change from y'all. We're over here. Lake Erie is about an hour, maybe 100 or 200 yards outside of my door right here. I live on Lake Erie. But basically, we've got a lot of young undergraduate composition majors that I wanted to make sure 4 years ago I wanted to put together a small project to make sure that they knew who that they were exposed to women composers that they may not have discovered before. So I started this project off initially just as kind of just a list of women composers and hyperlink to their works. And as I was doing this, it basically dawned on me that it's like, well, a list of names and a list of hyperlinks to websites isn't really all that helpful, especially if you're looking for something. So that basically grew into a large, almost 3,000 name spreadsheet that I and a few of my students here at Fredonia built over the subsequent year and a half. And then I basically just launched it as kind of a free, open to anybody women's composer database. 6 months later, in the middle of 2018, we included all composers of color, or at least we were opening it up to all composers of color, not just composers of color who are women. And then we had a website, composerdiversity.com. Another 6 months after that, the folks here at State University of New York at Fredonia agreed to allow for me to set up the Institute for Composer Diversity, which basically allows for us to use it's been a long day, an account in our Fredonia Foundation so that we can do fundraising. But that's it. Like, we don't get any state funds or anything like that, but they just allow for us to be able to have an account to be able to bring in funds, because at that point, I knew that I needed to bring in more people to help me. And this basically grew from one composer sitting typing at a spreadsheet for months on end to now I think we've got close to 15 people, more than 15 if you count our interns and research associates who are working on that, including a large number of advisory council members that help us give feedback, and we ask them, hey, how should we do this? They tell us, hey, you could do this or this and this. So basically it's turned into a large organization, which is incredible considering it's entirely volunteer. We have done a couple of fundraising initiatives last year and this year, but that's basically just to try and give folks who have already been doing the work some stipends to be able to help them out. But we have no one on salary. It's pretty much all volunteer. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the grant that just came down that will help us to be able to kind of further that. I don't see it ever really changing where we'll have a full-time salaried person, but the beautiful thing about it is that it allows for us to be able to have a lot of different people come in and help with what has become a fairly large organization with a lot of different moving parts. Um, the main parts of those that we've been dealing with over the last 2 years are primarily databases. We started off initially just with that composer database that I started way back in 2016. And that's good. I mean, that's kind of the basis upon which then we find the works that need to go into our works databases. We currently have, and there's asterisks and caveats that I'll get to in a bit, but we have a fairly substantial database of works that have primarily wind band works, orchestral works, and art song works, and we are currently building a chamber music database and a choral database as well. So, and hopefully, that once these things get up and running, they've already been running, but we're kind of, if anyone's been to the site within the last month or so, you'll see that we've muted the databases because we're actually going through a kind of an overhaul of them. But once those are back up, you'll be able to, if you wanted to be able to find an orchestral work by an African-American composer living in the States, you could just click, 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 boom, there you go. If you wanted to find one that had a soloist, you could one more click and then you can find all the works that fall under that. And it's been pretty amazing how that works. In addition to the databases, and we'll have time to be able to look at what these things look like, but I'm giving you kind of a really brief overview. In addition to the databases, which is resources allowing folks who are looking for music, we also do a fair amount of analysis, which is to allow for us to be able to look and see what programming is actually being done. We started with orchestral programs. This year, we continued with orchestral programs. We've expanded it to wind band programming as well through the reports that CBDNA allows us to do. And that is actually, once we get that up and running, it'll be a 5-year report to show what college wind bands have been programming over the last 5 years, which is great. Last year we did 120. I basically myself, I just went through 120 orchestral seasons of orchestras here in the States, from the very top echelon all the way through about midway through group 5 of the League of American Orchestras budget system. They have 9 different models based on how big the orchestra's budget is. And that got us to 120, which at that point I was like, okay, this is enough. I need to stop. And so we did 120 last year, and then we looked at as many of those as we could for this year. And we're actually going to do 2 different reports, one of which were the intended seasons that orchestras were intending to do in the 2020-2021 season. But then we're also looking at what are the works that orchestras are actually performing in the pandemic. It's going to take a little bit longer for us to make that a reality, just because many of them only programmed the fall season, and then they're waiting to make public what their spring seasons are. With the orchestral season analysis, we try to keep it where you're just looking at main stage concerts, classics series, no pop concerts or children's concerts or anything like that, and no chamber music or new music series, because there's only a few orchestras around the country that have that capability. So we wanted to try and make it as apples to apples as we could, so you could literally compare the New York Philharmonic with the Erie Philharmonic with the Rochester Philharmonic, and you could kind of more or less compare their seasons, even though they're drastically different budget amounts. This year, however, and we can get into this. I'm here for long enough that many of the orchestras that are out there either aren't having any seasons, or some of them are actually having kind of like chamber orchestra seasons in their main stage, but almost all of them are not having audiences come. They're usually just streaming those. But then there are some who have gone to more of a chamber music model, and they're, instead of playing on their main stage, they're actually going around to through whatever city they happen to be in and performing those works. And I just made the decision that in this year, there's no way for us to, like, it would be unfair for us to not count those, because normally we wouldn't count chamber works because that's in addition to the main stage seasons. But in this particular case, that is their season. And so it'll be interesting. And I do have some numbers. It's not completely finished yet, but if we have time, I'll be able to show you at least what the numbers look like. You'll see the back end databases that we've been working on in that.
I
In
just want
addition,
to, I
oh,
just want to
keep going.
just pause there for a second, because I think it's really important to point out why it is important to analyze that data, especially in this age of data analysis. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of analyzing and gathering that data of what works are being programmed and performed?
Sure. And actually, that's probably a really good. Let me bring this up so I can actually show y'all what this stuff might look like. I will share my screen here, and there we go. All right. So the what you're seeing here is just a smattering of the types of things that we've been able to break out over last year's season. But this is part of a presentation that I gave to the Association for California Symphony Orchestras. They invited me to come out and show them this stuff. But it's really useful because so much of the conversations that happen around programming tend to be anecdotal. It's really easy for programmers, artistic directors or conductors or whomever, to feel like they are programming diversely if they include just a couple works by women composers or just a couple works by composers of color. And because so much of what they're so used to having nothing in their programming, that even just having a couple composers from underrepresented groups can make it feel like, oh, we're doing great. And basically what I wanted to do is like, well, let's see how great everybody's doing. And so this image, and I won't be able to magnify it, but you can see this is on our site, where you can actually go in and see. I've actually gone through and shown what the percentage of works per season. This one happens to be about women composers. The one for composers of color looks almost the same. And you can see over here that a quarter, let's say a fifth of the orchestras had no women in their season whatsoever. And then it kind of slowly goes up, and we look at the percentage rather than the raw numbers, because some orchestras, especially the larger the budget, oftentimes their seasons will be 70, 80, 90 works in a season, maybe up into the 100 level when you're looking at, say, Chicago or New York or San Francisco. But this way we can again do an apples to apples comparison, where it doesn't matter how many works you have in a season, because smaller seasons may only have 20 or 25, but it's what is the percentage of the season that is diverse, because basically that's what the impact of the audience who's going to see those concerts, that's what we're looking for. That's ultimately why I'm doing this. If you wanted to go down to the root level of why this is important, it's for these ensembles who are performing to be able to impact their audiences, and whether or not that means that more audiences of color will feel more comfortable coming into concerts, or will be able to recognize that music, in this particular case, classical music, could actually be composed by people like them, which is not something that they normally see. That's important, but also, even if you have an entire audience of white people, and of course in many states that's probably what you're going to get in an orchestra concert, they too need to know that, hey, women have been composing for a long time, and composers of color have been composing for a long time, and for them not to just think of the repertoire as just this finite box that only so many composers can fit into, but it's really a much larger world with many voices that folks are going to bring into. So this is one way for me to get orchestra's attention, let's say. And I actually put this up on the website, and it did not take long for them to find it. The idea of orchestras being compared to each other and actually kind of getting named. I mean, I didn't actually say any, there's nothing on the site that's calling people out, but literally just putting them next to each other and comparing them. And actually, it's like I said, this is let's see, this is what the site looks like. If you go here, just to kind of show you what it looks like. So if I click there, oh, that's not going to go. But if let's see if I can make the screen a little bit bigger. There you go. Now you should be able to see. You can see that, these numbers here, the numbers at the far left are the budget level, the budget group that they're in, and then you can see, say Albany Symphony, which is way over here. Had 9. These are women composers, so it's 9 women composers out of 28 works in their season, and I think they were at 32. I think, yeah, 32%, along with the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra. And then over here for composers of color, that's Chicago Sinfonietta and River Oaks Chamber Orchestra again. So it's interesting how just putting up this graph, literally just putting up this graph, got noticed fairly quickly by the professional orchestras that are out there, because I think part of it is that they didn't realize what the situation was, and then part of it was folks who were working for those orchestras. They've been trying to nudge their artistic directors and their executive directors to do more, but they never actually had data like that in order to be able to make the case. And I knew that that's how administrators think, and so that's kind of why I dove into these other numbers. A couple other quick little things. No, I'm gonna. Oh, yeah, I'll show you this. So just look here at these 6 numbers, and specifically the 8% and the 6%. 8% is now for last year's season, that was the average amount of the season for women composers, and 6% for composers of color, or what we have now here is composers from underrepresented heritages. That was in 1920. Back in 2016, 2017, it was at 1% and at 2% for those 2 categories. And again, it's really easy for folks to focus on the raw numbers and not to understand how much of their seasons they could be dealing with this. So this is the one that's, and then we'll see if we need to move on, because I can go down so many rabbit holes here. But this is one that got a lot of attention, especially last year at the Sphinx, or this last year at the Sphinx conference. You'll see here, if you add up all of the composers from underrepresented groups, which includes all women composers and all composers from underrepresented heritages, which is BIPOC and Asian, everybody who's not white, 468 works out of the 4,000 or so works that were actually put into the seasons last year. 468 were by composers from underrepresented groups. 434 were by Beethoven. And it's just something as stark as that I think will help to using this data not as a cudgel, but as kind of more of a lever to be able to, get one's foot in the door and start to have people think about programming a little differently. If they realize that they're programming just one 200-year-old German composer as much as every composer who is not a white guy, that's an issue. And so that's, to answer your question, Chris, that's kind of why I delved into this. And there's so many other aspects of that that we can do. I should probably check in and see how are we doing on time, and what other areas do you want me to hit before we open it up for questions?
Well, just one clarification though, because um, uh, a work by Beethoven might be a 40-minute symphony, and a work by an underrepresented composer might be a 5-minute overture.
Oh
So
yeah.
there's also sort of an added discrepancy of not just the percentage of works by underrepresented composers, but actually the sheer amount of time
Yep.
that orchestra plays in a certain program, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of the best practices that we suggest on our site, is to not just think about living, because oftentimes it's that first 10-minute slot at the beginning of the concert that has been the bailiwick of living composers writ large.
Mhm.
And then figuring, all right, now we get to go to the more traditional repertoire. But yeah, it's the idea of actually getting orchestras to think about doing a concerto by a composer from an underrepresented group, or even a symphony, or however they're chopping up their concerts, to be able to make sure that people, that the concept of all of these composers from all of these different groups, living composers, women composers, composers from underrepresented heritages, um, to normalize it, so it doesn't feel, it's not that we don't want to feel it, have it feel special, but it shouldn't be unique. It should just feel normal, like any other orchestra, and sorry, any other composer at that point.
Yeah. So, can we delve into what the grant from the Sphinx Foundation, Sphinx organization, means to the institute?
Sure. Yeah, we'll go back here. So in terms of the grant, and this is, we it was just announced yesterday, so I'll admit we're all still a little um shaken uh in terms of discovering this, because it's not often that you basically get the equivalent of a phone call going, hey, we're going to give you $100,000 over the next 2 years, because you're doing good stuff. And so that was a great surprise. So the way that this grant is going to be handled, um is basically in two phases. The first phase of which is literally just to look at our databases and to prioritize Black and Latinx composers over the next 2 years. So we want to find as many works by Black, find as many Black and Latinx composers as we can, and with their consent, which is part of the reason why it's muted right now, because we're actually reaching out to get the consent of all of the composers, and we can probably discuss that in a bit. But we want to make sure that we have as many Black and Latinx composers in the database as we can, and then to get as many of their works in all of the different genres into our works databases as we can, because at the end of the day, or at least at the end of the 2 years that this grant is being given to us, hopefully we'll be able to allow folks the ability to be able to just search if they're looking for any type of chamber work, orchestral work, wind band work, whatnot. They should be able to find it if it's by a composer from an underrepresented group. So that's the first phase. It's it sounds very simple, but as you can imagine, especially once you get into chamber music, it's just gigantic. It's just massive. Um, and then the second one is that we want to be able to partner with both um, artistic organizations, ensembles in some form or fashion, as well as educational institutions. And I'm hoping that it's both higher ed and K-12, and a mix amongst. It's probably not just going to be orchestras, but the idea of trying to find a mix of artistic ensembles as well as educational institutions, and work with them to improve the diversity of their programming and come up with, not only help them with their strategies, but through this process, be able to come up with resources and best practices that everybody can use.
Yeah,
And I think
I think
that's sorry.
that portion is really important, and I'm going to risk of talking too much to kind of emphasize how important that is,
How
because
about it?
oftentimes, having been a public school teacher, many school teachers lack the resources in terms of time to be able to research and find pieces by underrepresented composers. So to have help in helping, let's say, a high school band director, or a collegiate orchestra conductor, or even a junior high band director, find these pieces and connect composers who are underrepresented. That's a I think that overcomes many difficulties in underrepresented composers being programmed, because just the sheer fact that the teachers lack the resource in terms of time to do research,
Yeah.
it already blocks put a blockade there.
Well, and especially with K-12, it's a there are a number of situations that make this difficult, because I've had a number of conversations with educators around the country where, especially with orchestra and wind band, where they want to be able to program more works by composers from underrepresented groups. The problem is that, and I don't know how many of you know the back end of how music education works at the K-12 level here in the States, but oftentimes they will have a business, let's say their school district will have a business office. That business office will have a purchase order with one place for them to buy their music. So that's usually a distributor like JW Pepper or Stanton's, or some other distributor. That means that if they need to go buy or rent music from outside of that distributor, they have to either get money from their booster club, if they have a booster club, or they have to literally schedule a time for them to go and talk with the school board the next time they have a school board meeting, and ask them permission to get, to be able to buy something outside of the purchase order. So that if we're talking about, unfortunately, we're talking about something like systemic racism. And that article that I shared with you about the idea of expanding the concept of what racism was, where it wasn't just something that was intentionally done from one person to another person, but it's also literally just the situation that exists that puts people in this particular case, different racial or ethnic groups, but it could be the same thing with genders or sexual identities, take your pick, any of those. But in this particular case, if someone wanted to rent music by a well-known Black composer who was not distributed by JW Pepper, they have to go through an immense amount of paperwork in order just to be able to purchase the music, in order to be able to do what they know is right for their students. And it's to try and find ways to be able to do that, to also look at required repertoire lists that each state has for their all-state and district festivals. Usually those lists are woefully not diverse. And so as you can tell, just as we're looking at all of these things, there are so many different aspects, so many different cogs within these machines, in order to how can you affect the most amount of people with the least amount of effort, because as I mentioned, there's only a few of us and it's a volunteer organization. And this, literally just popped out of one guy having a little extra time on his hands one summer 4 years ago. So now it's a matter of like, how do we change these things from symphony orchestras to state repertoire lists to K-12 business practices. um, it's going to be a long time to be able to make it completely work, but at least just bringing the attention to it and getting folks like music education faculty who are teaching the teachers to understand how to be able to do that, and conducting faculty in higher ed and at K-12, how can they start changing in certain ways to be able to make it easier for those changes to maybe happen over the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate. So, for example, I actually stopped conducting all state orchestras because, raise your. I'm going to put on a gallery view. Raise your hand if you played the following pieces in an all state or regional orchestra: Holst Jupiter, Dvorak 9, Elgar's Nimrod. Okay, those are the three most programmed pieces by any all state regional orchestras because they are easy to purchase for school districts. Every time I've tried to do an all state, I try to say, all right, well, I want to do this piece by a living composer. Oh, wait, that's a rental. We can't do a rental because all the districts cannot rent and they have to get purchases. I got that runaround so many times. And I'm the kind of person who lives for contemporary music. And no, if you want me there, I need to do a piece work by a living composer. But that end runaround was so frustrating as working with all states.
So those are just a few of the things that we've been doing, as I mentioned, between the databases and the analysis, and then to figure out what are other resources that would be useful, including best practices. One of the things that let me see if I can bring this back up. Oh, scream through those pages real quick so you don't have to look at all of that. But let's see. Yeah, we'll go there. So we'll share this page. So this is an example of one best practice that we've been starting to talk about I initially came up with this about 2 years ago. Maybe 3 years ago. I think maybe 2018 was when I originally I'd been looking at the numbers and then just had this idea of like, hey, one of the issues being that at some point someone's going to say, how do we know when we have achieved optimum diversity? and it's funny because I've had so many people go, oh, you're just like 50-50. I'm like, wait, the math doesn't work with that necessarily, because for one thing, like, and there are different people who feel different ways about it. I tend to be a bit more pragmatic about it, is that, look, there are a lot of works in the classical music, traditional canon written by white guys over the last 300 years. The idea of going to let's say orchestras or wind bands or choirs and say, all right, you're literally going to have to jettison 2/3 to 3/4 of your traditional repertoire in order for you to do this other stuff. That's not a good way of starting a conversation with those folks. They're not even going to take you seriously. But so for instance, the Baltimore Symphony for about 4 or 5 years did an analysis kind of like what I did, but they weren't as public in terms of what each orchestra was doing. But they were looking at, I think, at least for 3 or 4 years, they were looking at about 80 different orchestras. And the number that kept popping up was 2%. 2% women composers, 2% composers of color. 2013, 2014, 2015, it didn't seem to ever move, even when they were publishing these things and going, hey, y'all need to be playing more works by women composers, nothing would happen. And so what I've done here is I've kind of flipped it, inverted it on its head and go, all right, what if we gave folks a goal, like it's not a quota per se, because it's easy to say, oh, we don't want quotas. All right. But I think of these as like aspirational goals of, instead of just being okay with the status quo as you are, can you reach a minimum of 15%? And then if you want to do more, what I've come up with here is just kind of a rough estimate of, like, if you can program something between 15 and 20% of your season with women composers, and 15 to 25% by composers from underrepresented heritages, and then 25% to 35% of that season being from living composers. Couple things. First, those numbers are way higher than what they normally have been. So if we can get to this point, that's amazing. If people want to go more, that's wonderful. But at least at this point, it gives folks a goal with which to aim for. And then still, you can see, because I'm showing this as a Venn diagram, it's not like it's 15 plus 15 plus 25. Okay, so what's that? 30, 55%. So then you only have 45% of your season being dead white guys. No, it's like there's probably a lot more than that. And I'm talking to people at Cornell, so I'm not going to even remotely get into the math, because I'm sure most of the students in your class are way better at that than I am. But you can say it still shows there's a lot of room for traditional repertoire in there. It's just not 98% traditional repertoire. And that's the kind of thing that finally this year, for I think many, many reasons, partly because these conversations have been coming up year after year after year. And then for whatever reason, I think it was probably the 1-2 punch of the pandemic, plus all of the protests that happened after George Floyd's death. Basically, there were a bunch of orchestras and bunch of artistic organizations across the board that have finally figured out, wait a minute, this is something that we want to do. We can't just put out a meme, or we can't just put out a statement and then have that be done. There actually has to be meat on the bones of whatever they say. And now they're starting to figure out, what can we do to do this? And I'm hoping that being able to come up with best practices like this can help. How much time do we've got?
We're good, but I'm going to perhaps start to go to some student questions.
Please.
And yeah, so one I really want to say, so this week we tried something a little bit different. Instead of just posting questions, I asked students to reflect upon what they've learned so far from the many different speakers. And I was so moved by so many other things that many of the students have written, and so I shared them with Robert. So I'm going to put Robert on the spot a little bit, but were there any particular statements that really surprised you or touched you, or that you reacted to among our student responses?
I think what touched me the most, not to deflect, but I think what touched me the most was the evenness in which the statements were all more or less coming from the same place. I think that speaks to the weight of all of this, that so many of us, myself included, because I started off as a jazz saxophone player, but I also started conducting when I was 18. And when I was, a graduate student conducting, the idea of thinking of the composer's identity never even came up. That was the furthest thing from our radar, because you're thinking of tempo, you're thinking of, the range of the first trumpet part, you're thinking of, whatever. There's so many different things that people who are programming either chamber concerts or large ensemble concerts think about. That the idea of who the composer is and their voice and what are they bringing to the table artistically just never really came up. And Chris, I don't know if it was the same with you, but I'm guessing it probably was. Like, it's not something that we have been thinking about. But at the same time, and I kind of mentioned that because I saw that as kind of a running thread through a lot of the statements, that everyone was kind of like, oh, I never even thought of thinking about this, which is not surprising considering how we normally think about music, because we think about the technical aspects of it, and the artistic aspect of it. What's the concept behind the composition? What's the story? What's the narrative? What's the form? What is the harmonic language doing? All of those nuts and bolts. And being a composer myself, I'm like, yeah, those are useful. It's good that a composer's thinking about that and that the musicians are thinking about that. But for us to think of music as being just about that, it's really easy then to compare all works based on that. So you're looking at, okay, your rubric of what is a masterwork is based on this and this and this and this and this and this and this, which I'm thinking back to the article that I shared with from Alex Ross, where he actually described the idea that part of the reason why Florence Price and some of these other composers never really were picked up was because that the lenses that the decision makers were looking through never took that into account, took that in, like the idea of saying, hey, it would be important to hear what an African American composer was saying in the early part of the 20th century, irrespective of what the form is or what the harmonic language is. Literally, like, that's what this person is saying. This is the voice of someone from that community. It's, in some ways, you could even compare it to the way that anthropologists or archaeologists look at when they go to a dig. They're not like, well, this pot, I don't know, it's misshapen, it doesn't quite compare well with some of the other pots that we've seen. We'll throw it out. We won't look at that, even though like that pot might be like the very first pot built in that particular way, let's say 100 years before anyone else was making pots. Like there's a lot of different things, not to get too far afield, but there are numerous different ways that you can look at music and look at why a piece of music should be important for us to hear. And of course, some of that is, do we like the music? Do we like the melody? Are we going to be humming it after we leave the concert, or after we've been playing it for 6 weeks or rehearsing it for 6 weeks? But also I think it is the idea of being able to explore who these people were and what their voices are bringing to us. In many ways, the idea of being able to look at a work by Fanny Mendelssohn, let's say, and getting a small glimpse into the world of a woman in early 19th century, at that point, it wasn't even Germany, or Vienna. To be honest, I can't remember what current country she was in at that point. But at that point, all of the borders were being moved around anyway. But the idea of understanding what that person was thinking It's really important, and to come at it through that lens, as just being one lens of many, to be able to open ourselves, to be able to explore those different voices, I think is really important. And not just to be like, well, this is what my teacher, these are the works that what my teachers and what my conductors have said are good, and this is what their teachers said were good. And you'll notice, if you do some digging in that, it tends to be those lists tend to not get very wide. Like, one teacher has the works that they think is good, their students are going to pretty much think those same lists, that list is good, with maybe a few exceptions, and they'll add to it, and they'll add to it, and they'll add to it. But it's a very slow growth. And I think this is an interesting inflection point in our history, in order to be able to kind of break that mold and explore a lot more of these different works through different lenses, and not just to program them for the same reasons that we have been programming them in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I started the hour with a overture from Joseph Bologne's only surviving opera, The Anonymous Lover, which I've sent a link to the deep dive last Saturday. I hope some of you have went to. And then there's a free performance being done by the LA Opera this coming Saturday that I hope some of you will attend. But James Collin gave this a talk last Saturday about Joseph Bologne, and I learned so many things that I didn't know about him. And I have to admit, I think my first 10 years at Cornell, I basically was in the mode of programming things that my teacher said are good pieces. So I was also in that mode of thinking about, what does my students at Cornell need? What do they need experientially in this orchestra to have a good experience? And I will admit it, I'm the orchestra nerd, and I've always been the orchestra nerd. And I've said to many students, their first week of classes in orchestra, all right, look to the left and right of you. These are the people that, like you, love Shostakovich and Mahler in high school, and you're probably the only person in your high school, like me, that was totally obsessed about Shostakovich and Mahler symphonies, and it had all their CDs, and instead of whatever Beyonce or whatever you guys listen to, right? And these are the people with whom you can share this amazing music with. And so my criterion for programming, really, I wasn't considering whether this person was black or white or Asian or women. It was really about what my teacher told me are the good pieces, and I had determined, is it playable by this orchestra? Does it challenge them? Is it the kind of piece that'll bring a musical experience to our orchestra? So that was my only criterion that I was considering. But of course, that's shutting out all the amazing music. Just few facts. I know I'm talking too much, but I have to share this because I had no idea about this aspect of Joseph Bologne's music. That James Collins said that Mozart visited Paris 3 times, and probably they met on Mozart's third visit. And in the Marie Antoinette's court, they were probably housed for 6 weeks in the same house under the same roof. And Joseph Bologne's favorite medium was the Symphonia Concertante, and he wrote like 10 of them. And so until that point, Mozart had not written this Symphonia Concertante. But guess what happens? After Mozart leaves Paris, he writes our beloved violin viola Symphonia Concertante. So James Collin theorizes that perhaps there was a big influence on Mozart to write the Symphonia Concertante. Joseph Bologne was also responsible for commissioning or overseeing the commission of 6 Haydn symphonies, which now we know as the Paris symphonies. And so not only was he in charge of the details of how the commission is brought to Haydn, but was also in charge of the premieres of those Paris symphonies. So none of this was known to me as during my training. And I'm thinking, why did my teachers fail me so badly? I'm trying not to fail you guys.
Well, it's interesting as we talk about this a little bit, and I'm glad. Yeah, I wasn't really planning on bringing this up. I've never actually talked about this in one of these talks before, but as we're going down this little rabbit hole, not very many people know that I actually grew up in a museum. my dad was the director of the anthropology museum at Northern Illinois University, where I ultimately did my undergrad at. But he started there when I think I was like 8, and so I pretty much grew up in in his workshops and in the not only the exhibits but also the places where they store everything that's not being exhibited. And just thinking about this a little bit, you will, if you haven't heard about it, you will hear that there are a lot of accusations that orchestras these days are like museums. Like they are there to basically remind people of what the good days were back in years long ago when Mahler and Beethoven and Mozart and Brahms and all of those folks were writing music. Of course, back then they were just thinking of it as that was new music, as you hear oftentimes when we talk about contemporary music. But nowadays, the uh, the idea being that we can't possibly not play those works because we're going to lose our audiences has kind of morphed the system into a bit of a museum situation. And having grown up in a museum, I think one of the interesting things about that is that if you go to a museum, you will only see a small part of what the entire museum has. I think that's really, really important. And good museums, uh, I think of the museum that I love the most is the Art Institute in Chicago. I grew up outside of Chicago, and every time I go home, bar none, I must do a pilgrimage. I also married an artist, so we must go to the Art Institute, and I must spend at least 15 minutes standing in front of the Chagall windows because that's my jam. But the interesting thing about the Art Institute is that there are some works of art in there that will never not be shown. Because that's why people go to see the Monets, to see all of the different works of art there. But then there's all of the other parts of the museum that continually show new works of art and really push the audience that's going to those museums. And I think it's really good if, let's say, if we want to have chamber music or if we want to have large ensemble concerts be museum like, well then be museum like. If you're gonna do it, own it, be like a real museum, and make sure that the exhibits get shifted around a little bit so that, yeah, sure, if you really think that you're going to lose some of your audience because you don't do Beethoven's Fifth every year or every other year, well then do Beethoven's Fifth every year, every other year. But that doesn't mean that 98% of your entire season needs to be from just that corner of the musical world.
Yeah, I mean, when I first visited the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, and someone told me that only 10% of the collection is actually, so they continually cycle through, and I was just completely floored by that because my conception of museum was that they hang everything they own. But in fact, you're absolutely right. That I think orchestras should not run away from that museum title, but actually, as you say, like do it right.
Be a good museum.
Yeah.
So what other questions you got for me? Or I can find another rabbit hole to go down.
Well, so I mean, I'm going to Daniel Levanti's question, and she had a beautiful statement, but in the middle of that, she asked, what composer or musician you think everyone should know about, listen to, who is not properly represented in musical history?
Oh my goodness. Oh, no pressure there.
No pressure there.
Oh man. Which composer should you know off? Let's see. Throughout history.
Well, I'll give you two while you're thinking.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
I mean, I was trained by a student of Nadia Boulanger, and Nadia, as an older sister of Lily Boulanger, all of her life, she was a champion of her younger sister's music. who died way too young. And so everybody should know Lily Boulanger's music. So look into her music. And also, I've been sort of doing deep dives into Joseph Ballone's surviving pieces, and they're really fantastic. So I would really highly recommend people, and there are quite a bit that's been recorded. Not only Symphonia Concertana string quartets, there are a couple surviving symphonies. I'm really upset only one survives out of his 6 operas, but you get to see the only surviving one this Saturday for free if you want by the LA Opera.
Well, it's and Lily is a beautiful choice. I actually used let's see, Thomas Goss, if anyone is on YouTube, has a wonderful channel on orchestration, and he has done, talk about deep dives, he's done a huge deep dive on a number of Lily's orchestral works, where he just goes on in detail, just kind of analyzing the orchestration of her works, and it's really, really amazing to be able to see about that. In terms of, another composer that y'all might want to look up, because she is just so, what's the right way to be able to describe her, kind of eccentric a little bit, is Galina Ustvolskaya,
Oh yeah.
who I discovered back when I was doing my doctorate. She's no longer with us, but I think she lived into like the early 2000s. She was, if I remember correctly, she was Shostakovich's girlfriend or mistress, or there was a relationship there. But she had a very distinct artistic voice, and one of the things that you should check out are her symphonies, because she has one of the most non-traditional concept of what a symphony could be, where I actually performed one, or I conducted one of her symphonies, quote unquote, which was written for oboe, trumpet, piano. There's probably a cello in there, I think. A singer singing. No, actually, it wasn't even a singer. It was a narrator intoning the Lord's Prayer in Russian, and this percussionist playing like a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot box, like a wooden box, with this huge mallet, and the music would just go along. It's only about like 8 minutes long, but it's just amazing how raw and emotional it is. And you would just hear this and you're like, wow, who is this and what is this? And then to find out it was this very quiet, Russian female composer who composed almost throughout her entire life. And again, because her music is not exactly catchy for much of it, and is not traditional in many ways, I'm afraid might get lost a little bit. But I think that would be one composer that I think is definitely folks should be able to find, simply because, again, with something like that, you can look at it both in terms of, this is a composer who is female, but also this is a composer who grew up and composed throughout the Soviet regime. And as I mentioned, she had a relationship with Shostakovich, and people love to be able to, analyze the hell out of his music in terms of what did this theme mean, or what did that symphony do, compared to, or looking at like who was listening to it, and did Stalin like him at the time, and all of the things. And I think Galina Volskaya should definitely be in that same conversation, because I think she had a very similar situation. So that would be one.
Yeah, Alice asked to put it in the chat. I'll put it in the chat. I was actually going to program her second symphony before the pandemic hit, and I was going to pair it with the Shostakovich 5, because I thought that'd be a good pairing to have
That'd be
that
wonderful.
combination. And it's an amazing piece. So I put her second symphony, True and Eternal Bliss, in the chat, so you can
That's wonderful.
listen to it. There are like several recordings available on YouTube, so I highly recommend it. Now I'm gonna, so it's hard for me to pick out a question because I've asked for reflections,
Yeah.
but I'm gonna sort of go to Elizabeth Bunker's statement. She's a huge and very strict Mendelssohn enthusiast, and so she used to measure all other classical music and by how it compared to her favorite piece, Hebrides Overture. But after listening to all of these different conductors, she doesn't really have a question, but that's how her viewpoint it was. But after having listened to all of the speakers, she is reflecting on changing that sort of paradigm of evaluating pieces. Is there, in terms of the composer database, there isn't really sort of an evaluation system in place, correct? It's more of you're collecting the data of who it is, what they wrote, rather than sort of placing any kind of evaluative
Yeah.
ranking.
Yeah, most of you will notice at this point that just by the very nature of who I am literally the last person to be deciding whether or not a composer or a work should be included in our databases. The idea of gatekeeping is real out in the world, and this is a good opportunity to not do that. Um, what we do first, well, I'll give you a little bit of a background in terms of what I did do and what we are doing, because I think it is important, because the conversation has shifted. You go back 4 years ago, the idea of, oh, let's find a collection of composers to be able to do this, what we've been doing now for 4 years, uh, really didn't exist. There were a couple websites out there with, again, like I said before, long lists of names with hyperlinks. If you go to Wikipedia, that's pretty much what you're going to get. So the idea of collecting that public information and putting it into a searchable format and going to each of those sites and finding the different works that that composer had, at that point, we weren't even looking at the specific works. We were just looking at the genres. Did the person compose choral works or musical theater or jazz or wind band or orchestra? So we kept it very vague. But the idea of doing that and then putting it up into a public sphere was still really new, and that may and allowing people to search through those things. If I've done one thing new or relatively unique in all of this, I think that was probably the one thing that I brought to the table, was the idea of not just taking the list but actually making it searchable and browsable. And that was great. Earlier this year, we started to have folks question whether or not was it appropriate to have these composers in these databases without their permission. And to be perfectly honest, being the 50-year-old white guy that I find myself being at this point, I was kind of like, well, I mean, that sounds great, but this is all public information. This is stuff that I found, just out there. It wasn't like I was hunting and pecking through secret confidential files to be able to put these folks up. But at the same time, many of the conversations this year, as I'm sure you are finding out, not only talk about the ability to find these composers through a database system, but also to make sure that the composers are seen as individuals and as people, and not just as a line in a database, right? And so it it was an important thing to do, to look at what we were doing and say, okay, well, we have all of these composers, we have all of this information, but even if a small component of the folks who were in it were unhappy because they felt like they were being used, or their information was being used for purposes other than to help them, we needed to change that. And so it took a little while. We have to have these conversations, sometimes in public, sometimes in private. But ultimately, what we've done is we took the large step of muting both the composer database and the works database. And I can show you what those look like. But to be able to say, okay, we're going to make sure, because at this point, this was what, maybe 2 months ago, 6 weeks ago, we had about 4,500 composers, almost 1,000 of which were historical. So we had about 3,500 living composers, and we as an organization, we made the decision to mute those databases so we could then reach out and ask composers, hey, are you okay with being a part of this endeavor? And then also, this is the information that we have collected just by looking through your website or whatever we could find. Can you confirm that this information is good, or do you want changes? Or if you're not okay with being part of this, then that's fine too. And the last thing that I would want to do is to be doing something where I think I'm trying to help people, but I'm actually not. Like I'm actually making it worse. So that's what we're doing. So in order to I'll share this real quick just to let you guys, since you can't actually go to our site, but I can show you at least what it's going to look like. Because we have been adjusting things. So this is what the composer database search component will look like. And we've put a large note up top to make sure that people are going through this thoughtfully, that they're not just checking a box, quote unquote. And we want to make sure that they are not only programming works by underrepresented composers because they think it's just something they have to do, but they, like I said before, you want to normalize this. So you're just finding good works by composers who you might not have known about before. So it's allowing access to information that you didn't realize was out there. But what we don't want to have happen is for folks to be able to do things like only present works by, say, Black composers in one concert in February because Black History Month. There's a lot of reasons why that doesn't work, in the same way that you wouldn't do the same thing with women composers in March, because then you're putting a focus on them, but you're putting a focus on them in a way that literally separates them out from what the normal repertoire and the normal season is. And they don't appreciate it. I've heard many composers from those groups say that they hate being programmed like that. Or if they do, or if you are going to have a special concert, then make sure then that's not the only concert. So just to show you real quick, this is so that's kind of what that note is up here. It's basically allowing folks to really think about why they're using this and not just use it as a plug and play. We've been able to put together basic criteria. This will be things like this PD. I need to actually get them to spell that out. That's public domain. So it'll allow orchestra, let's say it'll allow folks to be able to find composers who have been deceased long enough that their works would be in the public domain. And I that actually comes from a number of music librarians from different orchestras who that's one of their priorities. They want to find composers, but it needs to be something that they can work with the public domain, and they don't have to go through the rigmarole of mechanical licenses and stuff like that for living composers. We have a lot of these different basic criteria, including LGBTQIA2+, and non-binary. And let's say if we do this, I don't think, well, let's just see. I haven't actually used this in a day. If we do a search, these are composers that have said yes, and that have given us their consent. And view details, let's see. So This is new, by the way. I'm still getting used to it, but it will allow for us to be able to show what these genre tags are. It will also allow for us to be able to show things like pronouns in case the composer wants to include pronouns, and even a personal statement. So some of that was literally just trying to figure out how to do that within the database. So, people were asking for these things, and I'm like, well, that sounds great, but how do we make that work? But going back to, oh, thank you. Going back here, you can also search through genres, and subgenres, as well as demographic criteria and location criteria. And that both includes city, state, country, as well as the country and territory of origin. That's really, really new. So it's going to take a little while for us to be able to do that. But I'm hoping that, give it 6 months and we'll be able to make that work. The best thing about this, and let's say it's not quite working yet because we haven't actually put it on the website, but one of the cool things about this is that if we do a search, if we do a search, let's say for Black composers, we do a search, it will also allow for you to download that search. So you can let's say do a specific search for a certain group of composers. You can download that and then do the same thing again. It'll also allow for you to do the same thing in our works database, which allows for you to, if you wanted to do a search for a full orchestra work by living female Black composers, you can do that search and then do a different one and save those searches. So does that help answer that question, Chris?
Yeah, yeah.
Like I said, a lot of rabbit holes to go down.
So we're almost to the end of our time, but
Sure.
one thing I'm always trying to connect back to our student is that this is not an effort that is 10, 15, 20 years down the road as an executive director of an arts organization. In fact, there are steps that students can take today. They can help. So I'm wondering if there are particular opportunities at the Institute for students, if there's a particular student who wants to spend some time helping to refine the database, or in any other way of being involved, are there opportunities like that?
Absolutely. We actually have a number of interns that are working for us right now. I actually just got done working with one out at Bowling Green University, or Bowling Green State University. We have actually interns kind of all over the country. When the pandemic first hit, we had a number of work studies at the University of Texas and the University of Houston that they needed something to do to be able to finish out their work study. And so we brought them on and kind of worked with them. So there's a number of different opportunities for us to work with that. As I mentioned, that we've got a lot of work to do between finding all of these different works, not only by Black and Latinx composers, but just all composers from underrepresented groups. As you can imagine, like our wind band, when we get it back up and running, the wind band is fairly substantial. Partially because there's just not that many works by it, so it's the total work is a little bit smaller. Orchestra still needs a lot of work to be done, and chamber is just going to be a beast. That's easily going to be north of 30 or 40,000 works.
Wow.
And it's just going to take a long time to be able to do. And if we can find folks who are interested in helping us look for chamber works for violin or for cello or for string bass or for viola, actually we have the beginnings of a viola one that I've got from other colleagues through the American Viola Society. But again, those tend to be just chamber works. We easily could have folks helping us out just with string quartets, because there are so many string quartets, and then to be able to find them all and then put all of that information in, it's going to easily take 2 years to be able to build all of that. And so if anyone is interested, please let Professor Kim know, and I'm sure we can find a place for you.
Great. So we're gonna, Professor Diemer has agreed to stay on a few more minutes until 6:25 for those of you who have more questions. But at this point, we'll take a group photo. And so everybody turn your cameras on, even if you're eating, just for a second so we can take a group photo. Here we go. I'll take three. 1, 2, 3. Rob, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for your work. And thank you for giving us something solidly tangible that we can contribute to make things better. So just a reminder to students that the Joseph Boulogne performance with LA Opera, the link is in Canvas. I really highly recommend it. I also have a private link to James Collins' talk. So if anybody's interested, let me know, and I'll send up a link on Canvas, although I'm not sure I'm allowed to share that publicly. Okay, so we'll stay on. So if you have to go to your next class, see you later.
Thanks, Prof. Take care.